So here it is. It's the last Friday of the month, and most people who listen and follow the show know that this is the time I bring two of my favorite people in the world on, Steve and Krys from
In the world.
In the world.
Wow.
And your popularity is rising, by the way. Pretty soon, you'll be on Alex Jones, and everybody will be poaching.
People will be stopping us in the streets.
Absolutely. This is a really.
Yeah, soon we'll need our own handlers.
Or maybe your own T-shirt line and your own line of supplements. But maybe you can go down that path. Yeah,
I'll go with the supplements.
I have a really funny story about mistaken identity. So I was at a party one time in California, Marin County, and this is around, I guess, 2010, maybe 11, and I think it was 2010. And so I'm at this party, and I'm introduced as, Robert, the astrologer at this party.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Marin County is like, everybody's into astrology. I mean, they're into everything, pretty much. So I'm introduced to this woman, and she's like, "Oh, you're Robert, the astrologer?" I'm like, "Yeah." "Oh my gosh, it's so great to meet you." I'm like, "Wow, man, this astrology thing is pretty cool. I've been doing this now for 2 years, and publicly, and I'm making an impact." And so we're having this conversation, and we're about 5 minutes into the conversation, and then she realizes that she thinks I'm Rob Brezhnev.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Who's probably from around there too, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, and I know Rob. We had a bit of a falling out, because he and I were, at one point in time, we were emailing each other back and forth, and we have common friends, but it was like, no, that's not me. So let's be clear, you guys are not any other Steve and Krys, right?
We're not someone else.
No, we're not Steve and Krys. We're not. We're not any other infamous internet couple or anything like that.
Okay, well, good.
No,
excellent.
Well, boring.
No, and we haven't reached the stage where we get so much email that we can't answer it yet.
That's in zero.
As in zero, yeah. Our email and our book sales kind of rival each other at this point.
Right.
That would be awesome. Why not? You have to hire an assistant. So let's get into what we're going to talk about today. And one of the things that you sent me via email, because of Krys's background in 30 years of working in the mental health field in New York State. Is that right, Krys?
Yes, it is. Yes. Third generation in my family, actually, working in psych hospitals.
Wow.
So I signed up when I was 18 and just fell into the job.
Interesting.
But
well, we're going to talk about that and some of your experience, and we're going to look at three kind of really recent glaring examples of, stability, instability, the whole, bringing this notion of what's mentally healthy into the public debate. What does it look like? Who has it? So we're going to get into that today. And the three things that we're going to talk about are the event in Nashville with Dylan Reinking, who, when he showed up, looked like your typical mind-wiped MK Ultra zombie. And then this Alex Minassian character up in Toronto, who basically or theoretically ran over people because, he couldn't get laid. I mean, let's just be clear about that.
That's the story.
Right, that's the story. And then the cherry on the Mental Health Sunday is Kanye West. Just all of a sudden coming in from out of the blue and taking the Twitterverse by storm and, creating seismic shockwaves throughout the culture in about no less of a span of 5 to 7 days. So let's get into this. And Krys, why don't you kind of give us a thumbnail a little bit about what it's like to work in that field and some of the changes that you saw when you went in that front door and then you left, and how it evolved or de-evolved. And
it was like an earthquake. Yeah. Well, I'd like to be clear that I was not what you would call a healthcare professional, because I entered into the stream when I was 18 years old, and right out of high school, I fell into the job because my family had worked there for 2 other generations. My grandfather was a supervising nurse, and all of my aunts and uncles worked there. So, I had an in. And I ended up working in the activities department. So I came in as what they called a recreation worker. And I would create my own programs. So it was a social activities post. And you would make your own job, which was wonderful. It allowed for tremendous creativity. So I worked in geriatrics for many years, and then I went into admissions. And from there...
Polar opposites.
Right, polar. And from there, I went into horticulture as therapy, which was the crowning glory of the whole thing. And I helped to resurrect an old greenhouse on the grounds of Kings Park Psychiatric Center. That's on the North Shore of Long Island. And we made an incredible program there. It was really stunning program. So using horticulture as a therapy, very non-threatening. So it runs the gamut. In that particular setting, there were 3 major psych hospitals on Long Island. Each one of them had between 10 and 15,000 patients when I first started working in 1968. And by 1969, they started that whole national movement of emptying out the psych hospitals. And it was like a bloodbath.
I remember that in California when they shut down Agnew State Hospital, and you had all these people just wandering around the streets drooling, and
absolutely devastating to the local communities. It destroyed local communities. It, not even mentioning what it would say to the lives of the people who were thrust out after being institutionalized for decades. They would just like patch them together with bubble gum and say, here, go ahead, as long as you can.
What was the institutional justification for that? Why did they do that?
I guess they were wanting to get away from what they called warehousing. They were just seeing that people were coming into the system and staying and not, going out and living their lives. So it's not like you have a broken leg, you come in and you rejuvenate and you go back out and live your life. People would come into the stream and they would end up there for a lifetime. I mean, I had patients who had been there, when I was in the geriatric unit, they had been there, as young women.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Just and in that, when I worked there for 2 years, and that's where Krys and I met, on the admissions ward. But for the older patients, the women, the most common diagnosis for the generation where Krys got in was unrequited love. That was the most common diagnosis.
Well, it was one diagnosis.
I thought it was the most common.
Well, not the most common, but it was there. It was there for sure.
So what are we talking about? Like a broken heart?
Yeah, essentially. I did have one woman who used to, every afternoon, she was very dignified. She would just get all dressed up, and she would walk down to the visitor's room and with her purse, and she would sit there with her little white gloves on. And I asked her one day, well, what are you doing? And she said, well, my fiance is coming. He'll be coming. And every day she did that.
So was she like left at the altar or something like that? Or was she?
I don't really know. I don't really know.
Could be.
But, whatever it was in her framework, it shattered her life.
Shattered her, right? It shattered her.
And she was not able to move on. So clearly she was doing this like, what's the movie? Groundhog Day?
She was caught in the loop.
Yep. So anyway, so there would be people like that. But then there were also, there were acute cases. And there were the really extreme fringes where we had people who were cannibals and, did the dreadful deed. And those who had killed their parents or killed the family dog along with the parents or what have you. So there was that aspect of it. There were extreme schizophrenics who couldn't function because the voices were so overwhelming that they couldn't even function. And they would have, I didn't realize it until one of the doctors said, you'll note that some of the schizophrenics have this very gray pallor to their skin. and they always have this like, just kind of like clouded appearance. And so there was one fellow who had these voices, and one afternoon, after everyone had left the greenhouse and gone back to their wards after the program was over, and I got a call from the social worker. And she said, well, I won't mention any names, but so-and-so came to me this afternoon after the program, and I need to tell you that the voices were telling him to kill you. So she said, I asked him, well, oh, that's very interesting. So did they tell you how you should kill her? And he said, yeah, that I should stab her. And so she said, oh, that's interesting, huh? So what is it that keeps you from actually acting on these commands? He said, oh, look, I'm fine. As long as I have a cup of coffee, I'm fine. And they always have a pot of coffee going at the greenhouse. So like,
saved by coffee.
Saved by coffee.
Wow.
So, and he was one of the sweetest, most lovely people I ever knew. But he was absolutely tormented. And the medication didn't touch it. Now, some people, the medication would help them and they would be able to function. But with this particular person, he said, no, Krys, I never get relief from the voices. So that was, kind of an interesting experience for me, because I would often be alone down there at the greenhouse. It was way at the back of the hospital grounds. And he would stay and help me clean up.
Great guy. He's a great person to help clean up.
Yeah.
Watering. He would see all the little people when he was watering in the greenhouse.
I try to instruct them. You would think watering would be the easiest thing to do, but it's a skill, actually. So I would take my time if someone new came into the program and say, all right, now here's what you need to do. Check and see if they're dry. Don't water them if they're wet, blah, 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 blah. And he'd listen, fine, okay. Then I'd come back in and he'd have the hose and it'd be like spraying all over the place, I'm like, what are you doing? Didn't I just tell you? He's like, oh, but Krys, don't you, those little people, they just love when you do that. They just love when you
So this guy clearly had a rent into another world.
He really did. Yeah. So
there was a lot of that.
There was a surprising amount of that. Yes. Yes. And so I always had the impression that I recognized traits in the clientele there that I had in myself. Only the only difference was the degree to which they expressed.
Right? Yeah.
So I looked at them and I was like, you know what, guys, you don't really need to take on this label of crazy. They're just like, that's a story. You just live your life as a human being and live it to the best of your ability. And I don't see a tremendous difference between who's inside and who's outside. Yes, it's by degree.
Right.
And of course, there are extremes, and there are people who are extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
But for the most part, a lot of those people just kind of fell through the cracks, ended up in the system, got heavily medicated, and then it would just be like this turning of the wheel. They'd go out
and come back in and recirculate.
Yeah, they'd stop taking their meds because they felt good again, and then they'd have a fall,
And to be clear, there are also a number of people who would come in during the winter.
That happened.
And that would be a place for like street people to come in for the winter. And because as long as you said you want to harm yourself or others, mostly just said, they just come in and say, oh, I really want to hurt myself. And they would have to be admitted. And they would usually spend the winter there because you'd have a bed and hot meals.
You get three squares and a cot. That's what they say, right?
Yeah, three hots and
a cot.
It really strikes me about your story, from an astrological perspective, is that that institution, a mental health hospital where people are there for however long they're out of circulation, right? That's such a 12th house institution and experience, right? And it almost feels like, we like in the chart, through our lives, right? Whatever we don't resolve or whatever we don't come to some level of integration with, it winds up going into our 12th house, because that's the repository of our unresolved, psychic matter.
Mm-hmm.
And from an institutional perspective, that's what these folks represent. And my feeling is that they're actually playing a role kind of as our collective piece, where, they're playing a 12th house kind of sacrificial role and taking on this psychic burden that the rest of us are just in some ways liberated from. Because when you talk about your experience, like, oh yeah, well, I can see myself in this person and this person. I mean, I think if we all had really honest dialogues with ourselves, we'd all agree that there are moments where we're fucking crazy, right? Little moments in time, right? Like strange little things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we move on from that little weird little momentary thing.
Yeah.
These people don't. And it almost feels like they're like our psychic kind of doppelgangers or stand-in at a collective level with their experience there.
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah, no, I was going to say, but not only for the society, but one thing I noticed also for the family, and whatever,
big time.
It was always be, especially the guys would come in and say, "Look, I'm not crazy. My mother's crazy." And then you'd meet the family, and I'd go back to, "You're absolutely right. Your mother's nuts." And what would happen? Yes, one person in the family would take on all the illness for the family, and then everyone else would sort of, I don't know what the exact word is, just to reflect off of that. And as long as they were crazy, our craziness is okay over here.
Right. It was almost like a permission to function.
Yeah. And so one person would take on not only for the family, but then again, like you're saying, on the institutional level for the society.
It's a very interesting dynamic once you see it. And I think that's where pattern recognition is so vitally important as a life skill. Not just in this field, but for your entire life. So that's why I love that book. What's his name? Christopher Alexander had this book that he put together, and it was primarily for like horticultural architecture. Yeah, not permaculture, but what Craig does.
Architects, landscape architects.
Landscape architecture, where he would identify patterns of human behavior. And then how would you structure your cities, your villages, your homes based on those patterns of human activity?
Mm-hmm.
It was absolutely a brilliant book. It's called A Pattern Language.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a short, fat, looks like a little Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just got each page is a different pattern that they would recognize in human behavior. And how would you architecturally provide to support that?
Mm-hmm.
So, but pattern recognition, I think that's why I so loved being in the yoga system, because what we learned there was how to identify human patterns and what is it that gives rise to how we behave and structure our world that we live in. So I think all this plays in together as one big ball of wax, that when you can recognize how something's coming about, then you have this understanding from the inside of how everything functions, and then you know how to be in the world. From that, you know how to act.
That takes a lot of awareness, and perhaps even some training, right? I mean, I agree with that, but that's maybe that should be mandatory in high school or something.
Well, it starts with looking at blueprint,
mm-hmm.
and what everything is fleshed out on.
Yeah, and just to add on to what we were talking about with the with this permission, this sort of scapegoating, is that it actually, what it ends up doing is giving you permission not to work on yourself, and to put the problem either into the institution. And this is, big time. I mean, it certainly is one of the major aspects of living in America, is the complete denial of everything that's actually going on.
Absolutely. And it's become even more prevalent, over the last, 10 years in my observation.
Yeah.
People get into, well, this is my truth. And their truth could be just completely and utterly, ignorant and insane in some ways. And I'll give you an example, right? Like there are people who do not take care of themselves.
Mm.
They don't eat the right food. They eat too much of the wrong food. And the next thing you know, they're going to a doctor because they're obese and their organs are overtaxed. And the doctor will sit down with them, even like an allopathic doctor.
Right.
Will sit down with them and say, well, probably what you want to do is take some of the strain and burden off your body and lose some weight. And that would probably be a good thing to enhance your health and maybe, deal with some of these conditions. And it's gotten to the point where people will demand that the doctor just fix what it is that they're going through. And they don't want to make any lifestyle changes. They don't want to make any alterations to their diet because that's their truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just one little sliver here where people get completely hung up on, not taking responsibility, which is really what you're referring to here, Steve.
Yeah, and it's also an addiction to suffering. And I'm going to tell a story. And I was a massage therapist in New York for a number of years, and I worked using a particular system that was like an acupuncture treatment. It's based on traditional Chinese medicine, and I would manipulate the points with energy, and then also massage along the meridians. And it was nice. It was a nice treatment because it was a combination of massage and acupuncture points. And there was early on, there was a woman I was working with had fibromyalgia, and which is, as far as not having to work much because their muscles, everything is just in complete pain to be touched. So you can only work really lightly and almost just completely energetically. And I started working on this woman, and as she was talking, it was early days of internet. And she had a fibromyalgia chat room, and she was so happy. Oh, these are the only people that understand what I have, and I can talk to everything about them. And she would just be on this all the time. And I went through, I guess I worked weekly on her for maybe about 5 or 6 treatments. And she was really improving. So her pain was going down. And then all of a sudden, as soon as she's getting better, I get this call. I'm sorry, it's not working. We're going to cancel everything. Right? And then I found out someone else who had been treating her previously, the exact same thing happened. That as soon as she started turning a corner, she got rid of the person. So I realized that they were emotionally addicted to their suffering.
Right.
In one of the commentaries in one of the Yoga Sutras written by, I think his name is Vachaspati Mishra, is that return to our suffering like a dog to its vomit. Yeah. Which is a great image, and that kind of sticks with me, and we all do this. I'm not saying I've transcended this, in any way whatsoever.
And remember Gurdjieff saying that man will give up anything but his suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's all in the mix, and of course, then that leads to this question. The rabbit hole is who is actually, the one that's addicted. What I mean? Is it a psychological thing? Is it a bacterial thing? Who is it that is within you demanding the suffering? And it goes back to clearly some of these people that Krys worked with and I worked with also at the hospital were people that were not alone in there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They had company.
For whatever reasons, they are cracked open for unwelcome things to be added to their consciousness and sensorium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those things obviously feed off of suffering.
I have a vague memory that there was a married couple, professionals in the hospital, who were working in one of the clinics, and they were both psychologists or social workers. And they were, I think, originally from the islands, and they were treating the patients who had these extreme, what you would say almost like possessions. And they were treating them on a spiritual level as being possessed. And of course, that did not fly at all in the state system. Mm-hmm. But very curious that there was someone who was brave enough to even bring that aspect of it in, that possibility in, that there may be other forces at work here that are holding the person back from getting well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, we can get into, if you want to get into a little bit of like sort of the traditional thing before you wanted to talk about what's going on now.
Yeah. I wanted to just add a little anecdote to
Sure.
what Krys just shared. It's one of my favorite stories about regarding psychotherapy and the notion of context. And this comes from Artie Lange in his background as a therapist. He was mad as a hatter, right? But have you ever read Knots, by the way, by Artie Lange?
No.
It'll drive you insane. Anyway,
what is the title?
Knots.
Knots.
Knots. Yeah. One of these days, I should just read Knots on the Friday or on the 15 Minutes of Flame. Anyway, Artie Lange, I think it was back in the 80s, like the early 80s. They brought a patient to him, and this woman was suffering from catatonia. Now she wasn't in she was like functional catatonia, like you could stick a fork to her mouth and she would eat, right? She wasn't in a coma. So they were trying to figure out, well, how can we reach this woman who's in catatonia, this state of catatonia? And Artie Lange thought about it, said, well, why don't we give her something to do? And he arranged to get her to become like a mannequin in a storefront. So they would dress her up and put her in a storefront as part of the window display.
Oh my gosh.
And as a result, she began to emerge from her catatonia.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, well, that was just freaking genius, right?
That is freaking genius.
And it really like switched off the light inside of my head about context.
Yes.
And that if the person is in the correct context, then the potentiality of them having a holistic experience increases. Yeah. And if they're in the wrong context, then the other begins to seep in and occur, and they become dysfunctional. And based on what society's rules and regulations are for whatever functionality is, boom, they're shuttled off to an institution.
Which brings you back to linguistics and how language creates worlds. So in the yoga system, they talk about that speech is a goddess, and her name is Vach. It's V-A-C with a little hook on the end, which makes it like a C-H, Vach. And they recognize that language is a goddess and is creative. And so that the feminine has the creative principle. The masculine in yoga has the witness ability, okay? And so as such, you recognize that when you speak, every time you speak, you are creating a whole world. And it just comes with the speech. And so, it's really important. And even the gods are brought out from that speech.
In the Rig Vedic hymn to Vach, it talks about how the gods come from Vach. I get into it a little bit in my book, Katabatic Wind. While I'm here, you're supposed to never say that you have a book without giving the title. Apparently,
it's worked for us, hasn't it?
Well, maybe this could segue into what we want to talk about. But what was really interesting about that time when people were being released from these state institutions all across America, not long after that, I think it might have been around 71, 72 at the most. That's when One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was released in the theaters.
And I did take my patients to see it, I would like you to know.
You did that? What was that like?
Well, it was a geriatric group, and didn't seem to make a dent. I don't know. I don't remember there having any kind of a reaction to it at all.
You showed them Harold and Maude,
I took the little old ladies with me on the bus. We had our van, and we went to see One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
You showed them Harold and Maude, too.
I did.
which begins with a fake suicide.
Right.
But yeah. But so anyway, you were making a point about the.
Well, I was just trying to kind of bring that into the conversation because I thought that was really interesting. Think that we're here these people are released, and now here we have this movie that shows us to some extent the guts of an institution.
Yeah, and around that time you had the whole Willowbrook scandal. Remember, that's how Geraldo Rivera made his name.
Maybe you can fill people in about that.
Okay, so that was back in the 1970s, and it was like watching a horror show. I can still see the black and white images in my mind from the nightly news. And Geraldo Rivera went into Willowbrook State Hospital in Queens.
In Queens, New York.
And it was like Bedlam in London, like the image that you would have of those horror houses where people are running around naked, screaming, throwing feces up against the wall.
Chained to beds.
Yeah, it was bad. And he really, to his credit, just pulled the cover off that whole ugly cesspool. Mm-hmm. And that did start some of the movement, at least for those people getting better treatment. But it was all around that same time with Cuckoos Nest and Willowbrook. And then the states decided that, we're going to go not with the medical model, but we're going to go with the business model. So they started bringing in, as director of the hospital, instead of a doctor or a physician, they started bringing in economic officers.
Right.
Okay.
CFOs.
Yeah. And then you started seeing things like, well, okay, we can't afford the toothpaste. No. They can't have toothbrush. That's too expensive, that kind of thing. But all that came as one big package. And then they started with the discharges. By the time I left in 1999, they were having quotas for discharge. How sick is that?
Quotas for discharge. Well,
quotas for discharge.
That makes, I'm not surprised. Was another movie that was, it wasn't as popular nearly as Cuckoo's Nest, but it was completely insane, is that film Marat Sade by Peter Brook. You know that movie?
Yeah, I did see it. That is a wild movie. You can hardly make heads or tails of it.
Yeah.
Peter Brook, he was way too avant in his guard on that one, I think. But he's the one who did the Mahabharata, which was the 9-hour production that we saw at Brooklyn Academy of Music, which was brilliant. The highlight of certainly my theater going career.
Absolutely brilliant.
And then you have the Jodorowsky movies, right? Which are completely insane. So there's this interesting kind of flushing of people from these institutions at the end of the 60s. And then you have these films that indulge in either the revelation of insanity or the indulgence of insanity. Because when you look at and really watch Jodorowsky movies, they go completely off the deep end. What is reality? What is magic? What is redemption? What is shamanism? And I think you kind of wanted to get into this territory a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit, because what happens, because what has happened is that element in our society has been suppressed, put underground, squashed, or it hardly exists, which is that whole divine. Certainly the shaman is basically a madman. You have to go, in a certain sense, mad to become a shaman, and talking about within the context of a tribe. And they were so powerful and scary that they always lived. They were liminal. They always lived right on the edge of the tribe. They weren't living. It's not like I just remember the last 20 years. It's like every person coming up into Asheville teaching a weekend thing on shamanism was someone who he was a really successful businessman, and now they decided to become a shaman. I'm like, fuck you. Go get your bones, turned into dust and reassembled in something traditional. Don't come here with your business model. Shamanism, it's like, screw you, but it was over and over again.
Right.
I have pet peeves, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I like that. That's the passion. I like the passion.
That's one of them. So, but, so this is traditional, and it would always be a calling. No one says, I really want to be the tribe shaman, it was always something happened, you know, or there was, you know, within, it was always a vision quest were always for the tribe.
And often
not for personal development.
Often grave illness to the point of
and
death.
almost always with grave illness
and rebirth.
Yeah, and that shows up with even that shows up with the Catholic mystics. You know, Hildegard of Bingen, Teresa of Avila. All these people spent an immense amount of time extremely ill.
Well, Krishnamurti was riddled with intense headaches.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that about him. And you know, and he made it into his 90s, I believe. You know, he did live a long time.
Yeah.
You know? So, and then of course there's the Heyoka tradition, which is similar to that, which is sort of like the tribal insane person who would, you know, whatever, put all his furs on when it was 95 degrees out, or, you know, walk backwards, just do everything, do everything anti. And that would be, you know, there was some sort of balance that needed, and some sort of, you know, irrational that needed to be fed by the tribe. There's some sort of, you know, divine madness, and, you know, and of course, dig deep into the Sufi tradition. Of course, it's all about drunkenness. Rumi talks about drunkenness all the time, which is divine madness, and the revelation is found, you know, in the madness.
Yeah.
And a court jester as well would be the only one who could actually speak truth to the king and get away with it.
That's right. And that was his function. That was his function.
You know, so there's truth in madness, there's truth in wine, there's truth in the irrational, and, you know, but all that gets suppressed, and, you know, and you know, we talked about this maybe the first time we talked, was about how this runs back to this movement into rationalism that comes out of Plato and Aristotle, and that's how it gets introduced in the West. Whereas we were, you know, we're at least in the ancient Greek religions and mythologies, there was this aspect of underground knowing, of shamanism that was, at least within the Greek city-states, that was incorporated into them. And there's a famous book from, I think, the 60s, written by a Greek scholar that's controversial, called Greeks and the Irrational. His name is Dodd, D-O-D-D. That was like the first person to really say, hey, look, you know, it's really not all about, you know, this pristine, logical, rationalist kind of thing that comes out of Plato. But what happens with rationalism, and my definition of rationalism, is that you can get to the real through thought. Right. And I think, and for me, that is complete and absolute fallacy. You can get to the real through complete and utter focus on experience, you know, and through that you can penetrate into what is real. Rationalism, thought, is an overlay on that, thinking about it, and it's an abstraction. And we are nothing if not completely abstracted. You know, science is all an abstraction. All the knowledge of science is just stuff about stuff about stuff. And we just keep on getting extracted further and further out of our lived experience. We had friends who just spent a month in Ecuador thinking about moving there, thinking seriously about it. And one of the things that he said that really sounded compelling, and they were in, you know, a small town, I guess.
Quito.
Yeah, and you know, so it was a lot of Quichua people, and then, you know, and Spanish, you know, from when the conquistadors came, but he said what everybody was just living their life, you know, and that was what was so fully attractive to him. There just wasn't other shit going on. They're just living their life. That's what they were doing.
That reminds me when I went to Wisconsin back in 1984. I've been in California most of my life, and all my life up until that point. And there was always a sense in California that people were on their way to becoming something else. You know, well, like, I'm doing this now, but I'm going, you know, but this is really what I'm going to do, wanting to do, studying to do. So people were always in some form of transition, in my experience in the Bay Area in California. And I remember going to get some shoes in Wisconsin. I was at a shoe store. It was kind of my first experience in some ways of, and it wasn't a fancy shoe store. It was, you know, kind of a clearance shoe store or whatever. and it felt to me like those people were just there and living their lives and being okay. I don't know anything about them, right? But
Right.
it felt very different. Like I didn't get the sense that these people were on their way to becoming something else.
Right. Like,
Right.
like
Whatever.
not like a summer job for a college kid. You know, they're
Yeah,
not like,
yeah. No, that was their job and part of their
Well-
life, and I thought that that was interesting, and it felt actually quite liberating.
Mhm.
very much so.
Yeah, and
Very
that's
much so.
that's one thing. I mean, it's gone. I have my, one just passed. I still have two uncles, one in their 90s, and one worked for Pan Am his whole life. Another worked for worked someplace in Manhattan for his whole life. And people just did that back then. You did something, and then when you were done, and
Right.
you weren't really looking for something else because it was enough. It was enough to take care of things, take care of your house, take care of your
Right,
family.
and that has been completely eradicated. This place that I'm living in now, there's huge amounts of money in this little German town that I'm in.
Right.
But the economy is a tourist economy. We get 3.5 million people that come through this town,
Same here.
which has 20,000 people every year.
Wow, that's big. That's
So what are they building here? Well, they're building hotels.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I guess that's okay. But, this one hotel that's coming in not far from where I live, they're going to have dorms on their hotel because they're going to bring their own workers in.
Huh.
And they're going to live there on that property. And one of the laments for people that live here is that they can't make a living wage here.
Yes.
Right.
They just can't.
Well, not in the service industry.
Yeah.
So they wind up working 3 jobs, none of which will give them more than 35 hours a week. So they'd have to get some form of benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And they're running around trying to put things together. And this gets to your point, Steve, that there was a time where these things were in place and a person could theoretically go along a certain path and it would be okay. They didn't have to deviate or derivate. Now, maybe in the greater plan, some kind of novelty, disruption, maybe it's okay. I don't know. I'm not going to go there, but it feels to me like it also kind of links into the topic that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Because if a person has to work 2 or 3 jobs, what are they? They're fragmented,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so now we're living in a society with a large number of fragmented people.
And that's just one level of fragmentation.
That's right, but it's a very fundamental one.
Mm-hmm.
True.
So we're looking at in some ways, this cauldron of cooking people that wind up being, close to breaking down, certainly dysfunctional on some level, right? And always engaged in some level of survival. And, I don't think the universal living wage is the way to go. I mean, I think people need to be productive and they can get some real self-esteem and growth out of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
But what's really interesting, again, this is, I may be verging off of the topic just slightly, but what people talk about is, well, this place needs affordable housing. No, it doesn't need affordable. It actually needs a business that creates something, right? And people can get in and part of it on all levels, distribution, administration. Nobody ever really has. I mean, I've been here a month and I haven't heard anything about that. People will always say, oh, we need affordable housing. No, you don't. You need functional.
You need more complex systems.
Absolutely.
What you need more complexity.
Absolutely. So speaking of complexity, let's make a little segue here. And let's talk about Kanye West, because he really is a topic of conversation that fits right into what we're talking about.
Good.
Let's go back in time. It was during the election. So we're talking 2 years ago, okay?
Right. Was it before the election?
It was before the election. And Kanye West it was either before the election or right after the election, but it was right in that spot where Trump was, the spotlight was on Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Kanye West was at a concert in Sacramento, California, and he went on a rant.
Mm-hmm.
And he went on a rant against the music industry, and he went on a rant against being put in a box. And I think it was right after Trump was elected. he was basically saying, give this guy a chance. And then he went on a rant against Hillary.
And some of the other rappers who were supporting her.
Right, exactly. And right after that, they snatched him up.
I mean, right after the show.
Right after the show, they snatched him up.
Right off stage.
That's a kidnapping.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and they institutionalized him. He went into a hospital in Southern California. And
you say Soviet Russia?
and Emily from Off Planet knows a lot about the place that he was interned in, right? So he's there for almost 2 years.
No.
He came out. I mean, we saw him probably about a year ago, maybe a little less.
He came out briefly to visit Trump when before he got inaugurated.
Right, it was at the Trump Tower.
He had a little visit with him at Trump Tower,
and he looked like the guy from the Waffle House.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Medication.
Kind of. Yeah.
He had that vacant, nobody home vibe.
Go back. I had no idea that he was still hospitalized for 2 years.
No. I take that back. He was hospitalized for a little under a year, right? I mean, it was
a long time.
He certainly disappeared. Yeah.
And then you would get these little snippets like, he's coming back or he's putting it together.
Wow.
So now he emerges, and he basically sets the Twitterverse on fire because he is loving Trump. Now they're both Geminis, which is interesting. So, and Gemini has this natural kind of, hardwired schizophrenia. That's part of the sign.
Tell me about it.
So, but it's interesting, right? I mean, it's an interesting kind of assemblage of being a human.
Right. Yeah.
And so now there's these two Geminis that are kind of bouncing off of each other, and Kanye's going on about dragon power, and he's standing up for Trump, and he's catching a lot of flack. And I mean, the whole, so he's emerged from this place, and it's almost as if he'd taken on this role of, enlightened madness, or however you want to frame this thing. Go ahead.
Well, it's like he went into the underworld.
He did.
That's what happened. That's the shamanic journey.
This is why I brought it up.
I see. Very good.
Yeah, so he reemerged, and just to help me understand, because I mean, is there, or at least 5-10 years ago, there was like no bigger person in music than Kanye West?
Yeah, Kanye West was closer near the top of his game, and yeah, absolutely. A lot of controversy around Kanye. One of the sort of street stories about Kanye is that he sacrificed his mother.
Meaning what? What do you mean he sacrificed?
Well, that there was a blood sacrifice that he was involved with. So Kanye was very close to his mother, and his mother went in for some kind of plastic surgery, operation, and she never came out.
And what did he have to do with that?
Like Joan Rivers.
Like Joan Rivers.
What did he have to do?
How did that map onto his?
Like somehow some sacrifice had to be made for him.
So there's an ongoing sort of classification of rappers who have made this blood sacrifice. In Kanye, and it's not just Kanye, like Jennifer Hudson, who lost her brother. I think she lost maybe one of her kids. I mean, there's their big thing where Jennifer Hudson lost relatives, murdered, right? So, and this is a theme that's pretty concurrent when you go into that rabbit hole. Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. Look at some of the Black Child videos. He really gets into this, and you can go person by person by person by person, and you'll see these people that are very close to them, and the blood sacrifice. Like for instance, with Puffy, P. Diddy, it would have been Biggie, right? Biggie was theoretically his blood sacrifice, so he could ascend and move on.
I guess what I'm not understanding is how is he connected to what happened to his mother?
Well,
it's not like he
So okay. When apparently they make the blood contract, which is a blood contract, and it's a contract signed in blood, okay? And the blood contract says that at some point they will have to make a sacrifice.
Oh, okay.
And then and the sacrifice is usually targeted and picked out at a certain point in time.
My goodness.
And the whole idea, and this could operate on two levels, right? On one level, that there are people that are inside the system that actually perform roles when they are guided, directed, and tapped on the shoulder. Hey, you go do this, because that's part of their deal. So what we're talking about is a satanic network.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
So in that case, theoretically, right? Theoretically, and I'm not saying that this is actually because I don't want to, get in any trouble, but theoretically, that doctor would have been part of that network.
I see. Okay.
Okay.
So this all goes back to Mephistopheles and that whole thing.
And then what happens? You get into Kanye's connection with the Kardashians, who are a den of witches, essentially, who are always practicing, their version of Enochian magic, black and white, and polarity, and and all that stuff. And Kanye becomes like this cipher and a conduit because he's a Gemini, And then you look at Bruce Jenner, who's part of that whole crazy mix, right? And he goes from masculine to feminine. I mean, the whole family is like one giant magical, operation. It's like a Babylonian operation. So he goes through that as well. And now he comes out the other side of this thing. And to me, it's like, completely mind blowing.
It is. And what he has said, at least with the supposed, insane tweets, there's really nothing to them.
No.
I mean, there's nothing. They're just basic, they're just basic little support of Trump, things like that. There's really nothing, nuts about them, that I saw
on the
anyway.
surface. Yeah. So why does it get such a reaction?
Well, this goes back to what we're calling the Trump derangement syndrome that we've gotten into too. It's that everyone else has to view the sanity as insane to keep their own sane premise going.
Right.
To keep the lie going, the truth has to be insane.
It's the old saying where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise.
Or the Thomas Zotz, madness is a sane reaction to an insane world.
And astrologically, this gets into that Sun-Uranus conjunction in Gemini.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So, it's like batten down the hatches. And it's so fascinating too, and watching like this real bifurcation that's taking place. So, I was talking about this interview that this kid Adam Green did, and he was talking about like on the surface, look at what Trump is doing, right? He hired John Bolton.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
He Mike Pompeo, and Haspel, the torture queen, and all that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, there's this whole other reality going on where people are like, we're like, I was on Twitter yesterday and I was following this kid, Jack Posobiec, who is total naval intelligence. Anyway, he's like, oh, we keep winning. Isn't it great to win? And there's this certain version of reality that's being driven, like psychically driven, like, right out of Tavistock, hammer. And then you look at what else is going on. It's like, well, really, do you really see like, who these people are that, have surrounded Trump and kind of, so it's leading towards this like massive, almost critical level of cognitive dissonance.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And then you look at, the guys from North Korea holding hands in the park, like two long lost friends.
It's like skipping down the yellow brick road, hand in hand. It's just.
Ain't that a trip, right? I mean, I find that one thing to be fascinating. I don't know what the hell is going on there.
I mean, one week they're like a nuclear threat to the world, and the next week they're just like,
little happy Korean puppies. They're just like, little kittens.
Well, what's really interesting? This gets into like the last pattern or the last pass of Saturn in Capricorn. And when Saturn was in Capricorn the last time, what did we see? We saw the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and then the wall went down, and there was some level of integration between East-West, right? Here we go. Saturn's in Capricorn, and this is like the latest version of it.
Not interesting.
And this North-South deal. And again, I was just trying to kind of wrap my head around, are there any other countries in the world that are divided or have been divided like this? I can't really think of one.
Like the Koreas?
Yeah, closest might be Ireland.
Even that's like, I don't think that.
No, it's not the same. It's not the same level, of course.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting.
That was a 400-year division.
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought up. The older one was East-West, and this one's North-South.
North-South, yeah. So, okay, we can talk more about Kanye and this whole kind of madness piece. But one of the things that I saw on a QAnon message yesterday on Twitter was that I wish I could repeat it, but it was something along the lines of, you people, like the government is powerful, but you people are many and more powerful, and you're going to have to do something. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting kind of message. Like, because for the longest time, even though it's only been since November, really, the message was, we got this, don't worry, we got this, the indictments are coming, and, this is happening, and this is happening. And again, this theme of winning, 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 winning,
right?
Which is also echoed and parroted at another level with the more kind of, hardcore, I don't know, Western Zionists. But there's a break in this, and it's like, well, what is going on here? Is QAnon now basically advocating that people take up arms? Right?
Yeah, it's not obvious. I mean, and of course, this look at just what happened in Armenia. People did take to the streets, and I don't know enough to know.
And I just want to say that I couldn't help but notice that the person in Canada who did the
was Armenian,
and just the day before or the same day,
or the same day within
there
a
was
day.
a Q post about Armenia, and that seemed oddly coincidental.
Yeah. This is a really fascinating time. I mean, you've got the whole Kanye thing. Again, in the tweet, I'm sorry, I'm just wrapping my head around this, but got the Kanye thing, and the tweets are, to your point, Steve, pretty mundane in a lot of ways, and even to the degree that they're polite. Like you live your life, I'll live my life, and so I mean, but it's clearly creating a disturbance in the forest, right, or in the field. Have you been following what's been going on with Natalie Portman?
Don't even know who that is.
No.
Natalie Portman is an actress, and she won an Oscar for The Black Swan. And she's been in a number of movies. She was in V for Vendetta, which is a film about programming, breaking down, mind control, a whole bunch of stuff, right?
Wachowski's Last Stand. Yeah.
So she has been this media darling, and I believe she was born in Israel. And so she has dual citizenship, and she was supposed to accept an award in Israel, and she wouldn't go.
Okay.
She wouldn't go and accept the award because of how they treat the Palestinians.
Okay.
Now she came out on Twitter and basically said, the Holocaust, is just another Holocaust. There are a lot of other Holocausts.
Oh, can't say that.
And I'm like, wow, where is this coming from, right?
Wow.
So Kanye is kind of doing this backflip thing on like Black Lives Matter and, taking responsibility. I mean, one of the things he did get into with his tweets was about taking welfare, right? That was in one of his tweets.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is an anathema to, the left and their whole social structure. And
Yeah.
And here we have Natalie Portman kind of doing the same thing in a different arena, and really, getting out on a limb and taking on some very sacred cows. And what's interesting is that Natalie Portman is Jewish, and she was born in Israel and had been lionized by that country and that culture. And now she's, hitting that third rail instantly.
No, and I give Lord credit too, who's an immensely popular singer from New Zealand,
right,
for boycotting or for not deciding to not do a show there for that reason, and she seemed like really reasoned about it. I don't see that they've gone after her the same way that they gone after Roger Waters or and apparently
Roger Waters is fearless.
Yeah.
Well, that's because he's made a lot of money already.
Well, if I wrote what he wrote, I'd be pretty friggin' pleased with myself.
I was watching this documentary on the banana the other night, and it was about how, because if you think about it, the banana did not become popular until the 1900s. It was a very exotic fruit. And they hadn't figured out how to take it from South America, Central America to the United States. So it was basically a documentary about the rise of United Fruit. It's a really interesting documentary.
Yeah, that's an interesting company.
So there's a commercial. They showed various banana commercials, like the Chiquita banana, right?
Right.
Who was like Carmen, what's her name?
Carmen Miranda.
Right. She was the banana version of Carmen Miranda. So there was this one commercial for the banana, which was, right around 1972. And it was this woman who was like celebrating a banana. And it was that vocal section from Dark Side of the Moon with Kathy, what's her name? Or was it Maggie Bell or who?
Maggie. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, and it's like the whoa, 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 whoa. We do that part, and it was like they isolated that part from Dark Side of the Moon, and stuck it on a banana commercial, and it was for the UK. We didn't see it here in the US. I thought, well, that's really interesting that Pink Floyd got into licensing Dark Side of the Moon, like really early on. And I don't know what they've done since then, or if they've done anything since then. But
I don't know. I don't come across, but I don't see very many commercials.
Anyway, I just thought that the Rogers Water.
Right. Getting back to Jodorowsky, of course, they were hired to do the soundtrack for the greatest movie never made on Dune that Jodorowsky was going to do.
Oh, right.
That's a great movie, Jodorowsky's Dune.
Yeah.
You saw that?
I've not seen Jodorowsky's Dune, no.
It's a documentary about him not making Dune,
right?
But the who he assembled for it, and it's interesting for like the person who Sting ended up playing in what's his name, the later version was originally going to be Mick Jagger.
The David Lynch version.
They had Orson Welles. He said he had to hire. It's a great story. It's a great movie. Had to hire a chef from a particular restaurant in Paris just to cook for Orson Welles on the set. That's how he got Orson Welles to be in the movie. I forget the designers and everything. Oh, check out the movie. Jodorowsky's Dune.
I got to watch that. That would be wild. So getting back to this notion of madness now, okay, at a collective level, which is chaos too. Like chaos and madness are kind of intermingled in a lot of ways, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you're ever around somebody who's like kind of, a little crazy, they bring with them chaos. Am I right? I mean, there's
big time.
Chaos.
Big time.
Oh yeah.
Big time.
So here we have this collective kind of madness in play, which it feels like it is, right? And it's through this kind of flux in the field where people like Kanye West and Natalie Portman are now saying things that, 3 years ago would really not be, in some ways, commercially or even socially admissible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's kind of a fascinating, symptomology of, kind of where we are.
Yeah. And we would have to whatever you want to talk about the phenomenon that brought Trump into office and his Uranus Sun
Uranus conjunction,
in conjunction, right, in Gemini.
Yeah.
You know, being the father figure, you know, has seems to have fostered that. I mean, it was happening. Obviously, it was happening beforehand, and I think, you know, things like WikiLeaks and the leaking of the Democratic emails and things like that was really brought, you know, a lot of things out into the open. But you know, you're right. It's the insane rational story that we've been holding to, you know, going back to 9/11, going back to, you know, the Kennedy assassination. You know, it's being fractured. It's been cutting up little by little by little because it's deep, wide, long, oppressive, and omniscient almost.
Right.
It's being cut up little by little. It's like, have you ever heard of cloud busting?
Yes.
Right. So you actually, and we've done this, and it scared the crap out of me. So I stopped doing it. Krys loved doing it. But back when we just had regular clouds, when we were up on the farm,
right? You visualize them, like, yeah.
You visualize them, and then you just start breaking them up into smaller and smaller pieces, into a grid.
Yeah.
And slowly but surely, you could break it up, and that's kind of like what's going on.
Yeah.
You know, we can only break things up a little at a time. You can't sit there and blow the whole freaking cloud away.
Yeah.
You know.
Yep. Well, it certainly seems like there's a kind of a big meta process at play here. And to be able to step back from it just a little bit, and I don't think we can see the big picture. I think it's too big. I think it's
too big, and we're in the middle of it.
And it really hit me yesterday on how we are smack dab in the middle of the Kali Yuga, because everything is in disintegration. Everywhere you look, every institution is disintegrating. There's not anything that hasn't been touched. So this is just a full-blown Kali Yuga experience.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Wanted to cover one more little piece here before we sign off today, because it's something we actually talked about, and I think it kind of fits into this picture that we're trying to piece together here. And that is what you brought up before we, you know, hit record on this, which was the reemergence of the Obama birth certificate.
Right.
And you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it won't take long, but, you know, and personally, that when I first heard about it, I just thought that was just too far. You know, how could that sort of a forgery take place in this day and age? So, you know, that was, you know, obviously where I was at that for a long time. That was like a line I couldn't cross. And then, you know, eventually I was open to it, and then of course you did that really nice show on Gaia about you know, working with what did you do? You shifted the birth certificate to having taken place in Kenya, if I'm correct, and it's how things fit much nicer that way. But what emerged last week and has just been buried with everything else, and this is from this guy Ed from the Outer Light, whose show we enjoy. He's in New Zealand, and I guess that gives him a certain amount of distance and perspective on things, I think. But what someone did was take the file that's available on the government website, the file of the birth certificate that they put up as purportedly a PDF, or it's not a PDF, but it was actually an Adobe Acrobat file of was supposedly the actual birth certificate. So if that's what it is, it's from whatever it was, 61 to something like that.
61.
Right. And so it wouldn't be a made file. It would just be a picture of a single thing. Right. That would be, you know, like a PDF. It would, you know, it wouldn't be a manipulatable piece of text.
Right.
So what this person did was use an old version of Adobe Acrobat, which is available. And he did that, opened up the birth certificate in the older version, because this doesn't happen in the newer versions, and you can completely manipulate the text. You can pull out the number, pull out what's typed, pull out the signatures. You can do everything separately, just like a completely fabricated file. So this guy, Ed from the Outer Light, he didn't just take the person's word for it, but he went, downloaded that older version of Adobe Acrobat, downloaded the file, opened it up into, and just showed you, here, look, this is what happens. And then there was a birth certificate of I think a girl who was born like 3 days after that in the same hospital.
Yeah.
And you were able to take the doctor's signatures, who would have been probably the same doctors, and slide them over to cover over what was on the Obama birth certificate, and the signatures overlap perfectly. So
Right.
in other words, they were, and they were signatures. So they would, if you're writing on a space, you would write it a little differently each time.
The only
Right.
way would be if it was a stamp.
Right.
Right. And I remember the birth certificate that you're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is this shows, if nothing else, I mean, it shows that the birth certificate on the government site is a complete forgery.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's plainly obvious. Well, you can extrapolate easily back to that than that the birth certificate itself, I mean, the time and date. It's not like they had to recreate the thing if it was real.
Right.
So that's obvious evidence that blows me away, really, because that's pretty friggin' deep, to change someone's name and nationality and then, import him as a president.
I find it interesting and compelling that you started off by saying, I just couldn't go there. And for years, it would be, you'd hear these rumors and these stories about what's going on with these personalities in politics. And you just said, it's just too crazy. I'm not even going to look at the video because it's just crazy.
Speaking of crazy.
Right? Speaking of. But then something really shifted for us after the election. I don't know what, but it was palpable. The very next morning, when we got up and saw the news, Trump won, for some reason, we both experienced this sense of calm. And it was inexplicable because we had always just been like, oh, please, can't go there. And okay, well, this is an interesting observation. So we just observed that feeling, that response that our body was having.
By the way, I had the same response.
Did you really?
Yeah, yeah.
And it was not a thinking thing. It was not up in the head.
I felt very calm, very peaceful. It was like that whole week was.
That was it. And I said, we really have to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
And another thing that slipped in with that was this a whole trend now of creativity. It seemed like after that, there was a burst of creativity, I'll say on a personal level, but I also observed it in people around me.
A lot of our friends who are artists.
But there was this shift internally to be willing to listen to what the other side was saying. And I had always just been one of those, I would have to say, arrogant liberals who really thought that the conservatives were just batshit crazy.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, all right, I'm going to listen. I'm going to look. I'm going to start to hear what other people have to say and take it at face value and just respect what they're saying. And I think that's the difference between some of the other people we know who still can't even, like Steve calls it, the derangement syndrome, the Trump derangement syndrome. You can't even have a conversation about Trump.
Remember the day after the election? Everybody was
in this deep depression and
the nuts, and we went to.
They were giving out chocolate.
I went to Whole Foods. They were giving out chocolate on the checkout line to everybody to get them through.
Here's your soma.
Yeah, but I mean, it goes as far as Steve being willing to hear what Ed from the Outer Light had to say about the birth certificate. There would have been a time where we just would have ignored it.
Or not listened.
That's just too crazy. I'm not even going to listen to that.
Right. Too crazy. Right. There's the theme. Too crazy.
Too crazy.
Insanity. Right. Madness.
Right. But this is but here we are in the inverse world where what's sacred has been co-opted by the profane and by the dark forces and all sacred symbols and things like that. And and to get back to what we went to before and maybe wrap it up, that it all goes back to ourselves. And like you said, you have to be willing to be open, have to be willing, as you've said a bunch of times, willing to be wrong, willing to say, well, that's it, because this is crazy. This is what the time is about. Everything is shifting. how we get to our access to our inner selves is shifting. It's got to be reevaluated continuously.
I think part of getting through this period is to be flexible, like a willow branch, and be able to bend.
Yeah, I think bamboo is a pretty good totem.
Really strong and really useful in a lot of ways.
Yeah, pretty resilient. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm telling you, these are really interesting, mind-blowing, creative, chaotic, catastrophic, catalytic times that we're living in. And there are going to be times when it'll be very uncomfortable for people. And there'll be other times when, you can kind of move into that space and play with it and, bounce off of it and challenge your own assumptions in a lot of ways too.
I think that's really good.
And in the Greek tradition, there's the what they call the crossroads. Yeah, is called the trihodos. So for the Greeks, their crossroads was actually a Y, 3 roads coming together. And to be at those crossroads was a really, really sacred space because you had to be open to all the possibilities of knowing what to do. Right. So there is a tradition of this period that we're in being a very, very sacred and challenging place because, when you're on the road, well, you know which way you're going, you know what the hell to do. But when you're at the crossroads, everything has to be open to understand where you need to go, what choices. And
they have that image in Michael Dame's book, Mythic Ireland, which I highly recommend. They have a beautiful old black and white photo of people dancing in the crossroad, right at the cross. And that was a thing.
Interesting.
Dancing in the crossroads.
And that's where all the swearing was done, right on the edge of town. They had a swearing cross. So, everybody just hang in there. But, just got to be open and be willing to be wrong and be willing to just look inside yourself and see what's going on.
Absolutely.
And do your best not to incorporate, all the negative stuff that's being tossed at you left, right, up, and down from the 6 directions.
Yes. And to remain fluid, I think, is a really, really important piece around all this. Yesterday, so for me personally, when I was living in Austin, I lived about 2 miles away from maybe a little less than 2 miles from what's called the Y. And it was what you're talking about, an intersection between 2 highways, which created a Y. And trust me, there was a lot of cursing going on there because of the amount of traffic that was bottled up at the Y. So I lived near the Y for 5 years. And when I moved out here, I moved to the edge, right? So now I'm on the edge. I'm on the periphery, which brings us back to sort of the start of the conversation about, and I'm not saying I'm a shaman, but I can relate to living on that edge and on that periphery. So it's an interesting, for me at least, an interesting experience. And yesterday I was going through a number of different moods and untangling pieces, in my life, which I've had a lot of opportunity to do since I've moved out here. And invariably, flashing through some of those moods, which were slightly discordant. And I was playing with a little bit of divination, and I ran across this really interesting deck called the Symbolon. I don't know if you've ever encountered it. No. It's a pretty powerful deck. And so I was playing with it yesterday, and the card I got was the Actor. So I was thinking, it was like the inquiry was, how can I move through this time? And so the card was the Actor. And it was basically saying that it's okay to play a part. It's okay to play a role, but it's also okay to take the mask off. And I think that might be helpful for people, and to not get so attached to the roles that we're playing, but at the same time, to be able to play some of those roles and to play them to the hilt, right?
Be in the world, but not of it.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I think at the very least, like Hollywood or cinema or plays can teach us is that when people are assuming roles. Like when you watch Olivier or, or Brando, I mean, they are in the freaking role, right? I mean,
Yeah, they
they're in,
inhabit the role.
yeah. And then they take the mask off and, they live their lives to the best of their abilities, unless, of course, you continue that role after the movie, like some actors do, which is a little bit disastrous. But I think there's something in there for us during this time.
Yeah, thought of
right?
Heath Ledger.
Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
you made
Heath Ledger, for sure. And also
somebody.
Val Kilmer during the Doors film.
Really?
Like he was Jim Morrison off the set. Like,
Hmm.
and David Bowie, after he did Man Who Fell to Earth, he was still that guy, Thomas Newton, for about, a year and a half. Yeah. So that's the danger of putting the mask on. You wear it too long and you become stuck in the role. It becomes glued to your face.
It's like, thinking that
Right.
you are your ego.
Right. Well, you have to have, some sort of coherent personality, under the mask.
Well, that brings astrology into the discussion. You have the rising sign and the ascendant, which is the mask.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the sun sign.
Mm-hmm.
And those are two like potentialities that we can play out in an interesting, integrated kind of way.
I always like to look at experiences in life as mirrors or shadows of a divine impulse.
Mm-hmm.
And so seeing that role of an actor is a recapitulation of the divine role, that we are really all this divine being or experience going through individual roles, playing a role on a stage, as Shakespeare would say. But it only has meaning or relevance because it mirrors a divine principle.
Mm-hmm.
Archetype.
Yeah. What's the famous masks of God?
Right.
The hero with 1,000 faces, right? So, I mean, there's basically theoretically two ways in which we can, how do I say this, reveal the truth or be transmissions for the truth. One is a stripping away and there's no mask at all. Everything is translucent. And the other is putting on a number of different masks, and they're all variations of, some vision or face of God, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
in
that realm, madness is theoretically acceptable, right?
Yes.
For a brief period of time. Allows us to
Yes.
Yes. And madness will get you in touch with the divine unity to a certain extent, because you'd have to lose yourself in order to be mad. You have to lose your ego, and your ego is really what separates us.
Yeah.
From that realization, the idea that we are the ones doing all this stuff that we're doing when it's really just being done through us.
Right. Absolutely. Well, that's a wonderful sentiment and thought, I think, to end our Friday soiree on. What do you think?
Yeah. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great conversation. Yeah, absolutely. Tell people about where they can get a hold of you.
Okay. Logosophiabooks.com. And in fact, we finally finished the 7 volumes of the complete works of Fitzhugh Ludlow. It's an incredible 19th century writer with his biography by my dear friend and co-editor of the series, Don Dolcinos. And so
he did a fabulous job.
It's a great biography. It was originally put out by Autona Media, but we updated it, re-illustrated it, and it's spectacular. And the Logosophia.com website is where Logosophiabooks.com. Thank you. Is where it is. You won't find it on Facebook because we are off Facebook. Au revoir to that. And, So that's where you can find us. There's all our contact information is there. We do not hide. We do not run. But we don't get contacted either. So.
Well, thanks again for being
You're welcome.
A part of this experience, and we'll see you 2 a month from basically today, last Friday.
Yeah,
I'm sure it'll be interesting.
And we'll have a lot more to talk about. Thanks again, guys.
All right.
Quite
Thanks.
welcome.
Bye-bye.